One of the recurring themes on this channel is me lamenting the fact that we don't have true high-speed rail in the United States. But it's really worse than that. Even our national map of conventional passenger rail has massive holes in it. So today I wanted to share my analysis of what the most important gaps are and what we as a country are doing to fix them. And I'm not going to do my usual intro today. If you watch this channel, you know what I generally do. I begin with a question, I give some background on why I think it's an important question. I walk through the data sources and methods I use to answer the question, and then I give you my answers, usually in the form of a top 10 list. And today's no different, except that this topic, which is gaps in our national passenger rail network, is extremely timely because the outgoing administration put a ton of political effort into investing in passenger rail to a level that none of us, I think, have ever seen in our lifetimes. And I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the Corridor Identification and Development Program and the bipartisan infrastructure law broadly. But it's really just now occurring to me that I'm far too ignorant to explain all this stuff coherently, so instead I'm going to bring in somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. All right, so I rarely, and by rarely I mean never, have guests on my channel. It's always just me. Okay, so full disclosure, I am not the world's smoothest interviewer, but bear with it because Secretary Pete is so good at articulating so many of the things I talk about on this channel. And I really wanted to get into this by having him give his perspective on just how important the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Corridor ID program are. And we end up getting into all kinds of interesting stuff, so I'm just gonna shut up and let Secretary Pete talk.
Yeah, so it's a great time to reflect on just how much the infrastructure package delivered. It's been 3 years since the president signed it. I was there that day on the South Lawn of the White House, and we knew that it was going to open up a new era for transportation, but I didn't even know how much was ahead. One way I've thought about it as somebody who visits a lot of the projects we fund is, if I set about to visit one project a day out of the 66,000 projects we've supported, for the rest of my life, I wouldn't live long enough to see them all. It would take about 180 years to see all the projects that we've already identified. 14,000 of them are done. Many of them are just getting underway. Some of them are streetscape projects that could be done in one construction season that are going to make a community or a neighborhood safer. Some of them are multi-billion-dollar, decade-long projects like the Hudson Tunnel effort that represent some of the most complex public works projects in the United States in my lifetime. And what's exciting is that it really is the comprehensive lift that our infrastructure has needed. And after years of frustration that Infrastructure Week came and went, I remember living that as a mayor, hoping Washington would help us, believing that the previous administration would do something, and never happened. The fact that we're now in a real infrastructure decade is it's just something that's been such a privilege to work on.
A couple things here. I'm not going to break in and talk about every single project Secretary Pete brings up here, but the Hudson River Tunnel project is absolutely massive, purportedly the largest project in the history of US DOT, and you can certainly criticize the cost of it, and the Secretary will get into that topic a bit later, but that single project is going to deliver just massive, massive benefits, and I'll leave links down the description so you can read up on it later if you want. Second, I was working as a transportation consultant during the entirety of the previous Trump administration, and the same pain the secretary felt as mayor of South Bend when Infrastructure Week just never materialized was pretty bad for consultants too. It was just month after month after month of no federal grants being announced and RFPs just drying up. It's not a good situation for cities, and it's certainly no good for people working in planning and infrastructure, whether they're in the public or the private sector.
I mean, even in the last week, there have been several announcements about new funding coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, including a whole host of projects on the Northeast Corridor. Can you talk a little bit more, because you mentioned the Hudson River Tunnel. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I've made the point on my channel before that the Northeast Corridor, and I don't even live in the Northeast, I live in the Pacific Northwest, but you could definitely make the argument that the Northeast Corridor is by at least an order of magnitude more important than any other corridor in the US. And you could make the argument we should be spending like almost every last penny that we spend on passenger rail should be in the Northeast Corridor. How do you think about that? Because obviously that doesn't make any sense politically. Like you can't you can't just spend all the money in one place. Like, I get that. But how do you think through that kind of rationally and politically?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it is it's not about a favor to one region. It's recognizing the fact that there's no other region in the U.S. where more people depend on train service. And that's partly a tragedy of what's happened in the rest of the country, not having as robust rail service.
Mm-hmm.
But it's partly a recognition of the achievement there and how important that rail corridor has proven to be. So, of course, with hundreds of thousands of people a day counting on something like the Hudson River Tunnel, we know that we've got to do a huge level of investment, frankly, just to have stability and reliability for the service we've already got, but also to lay some groundwork for that service to go to the next level. It's different from what we're doing in other parts of the country where there is no rail service and we're trying to introduce it, or the rail service is unreliable and we're trying to improve it. Or, like we recently marked in Mobile, Alabama with the Gulf Coast rail, place where there was service and then we lost it and we're trying to get it back. Truth is, we are digging out of a backlog on things like that, whether it's maintenance or whether it's just access to service. But there's no reason why we can't vault ahead of where we once were and be the railroading nation that we were at the time that America really became the world leader economically.
I actually did a whole bunch of research before this call, and I had no idea what he was talking about. But yes, passenger rail between New Orleans and Mobile is a thing.
For those areas outside of the Northeast Corridor where it's much more commonplace to take the train, I mean, you'll often hear in other parts of the country, that passenger rail is old technology and we should be investing in the next thing like Hyperloop or maglev or whatever. A lot of people tune into my channel to kind of get the good arguments for why the things that they care about matter, so that when they go to like Thanksgiving and they talk to their relatives, they can explain the argument for passenger rail. What do you think is the argument for investing in passenger rail, not just in the Northeast Corridor, but in regions all over the country?
I guess the way I think about it is if a rail skeptic says times have changed, I would say, yeah, not only have times changed in a way that makes rail more important and not less. And there's several things that I mean by that. One, roads have only become more congested. They become so congested in some areas that you literally could not widen your way out of that problem. You've got to create alternatives. A second is that, clean air and climate was not something people were thinking about in the time of the creation of the National Railroad Network or, frankly, the interstate highway system. We now know how important that is, and that pound for pound, the best way to move a person or a ton of goods, at least over land, from a perspective of preventing pollution, is to do it by rail. So a lot of it is about efficiency. It is about modernity. And I think that's why many of the places that we respect and regard as some of the most modern places in the world have made sure that there's excellent passenger rail. I also think there's frankly a sort of somewhat nationalist way to explain this that just says, hey, if somebody in Japan or Germany or England or frankly, Morocco or Italy or Turkey has a certain level of passenger rail service, why should Americans settle for an inferior level of service? Nothing in America should be inferior. And yet we've tolerated that for too long when it comes to passenger rail. Not because the folks who work on passenger rail aren't good at it, but because we haven't put in the resources. We get that right, so many opportunities open up. And I really think 21st century conditions argue for passenger rail even more than 20th century conditions did.
Yeah, so if you're hanging out with family or friends over the holidays, as one does, and they're the type of people who don't spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, just play them that part.
Yeah, I'm having nightmares about people coming from all over the world for the 2026 World Cup and hoping to get between American cities. But the way they're used to being able to do that, and finding that it's just it's not to the standard that they're used to in their own countries in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and look, we could change that, not overnight, but
Yeah.
part of what I'm excited about with the Nevada to Southern California rail line, for example, is that instead of people coming back from, let's say, Japan, saying, I was on this amazing train, why can't we have nice things here? people come back from Vegas and say, I was on this amazing train on American soil. Why can't we have this in, Michigan, where I live?
Hmm.
And I want people, you want to know what success looks like. Success looks like someday, and I'm not saying it's anytime soon, but someday, somebody gets home to their family in Japan and says, man, if we could only have the railroads that they have in the United States.
If you're new to this channel and you don't know what Brightline West is, I have a video all about it where I analyze how competitive it is with air and highway travel based on travel times from 5 different outposts of the world's finest restaurant, and I'll link that down below.
Going back to the corridor identification program, so I was down in Tucson, Arizona at the beginning of the month.
True story. The Rail Passengers Association invited me down to Tucson to speak at the Rail Nation event, and I'll talk more about Tucson next week, but for now, RPA is a great organization to support if you care about passenger rail in the US. I'll leave a link down in the description. Oh, other news, I think the embargo has now been lifted, and I can announce January 31st in New York, live show with The War on Cars at Hunter College on the Upper East Side. I cannot predict exactly how fast tickets are going to disappear for this, but given the way most of my events have gone, and given that The War on Cars is very cool, well, I won't speculate other than to say the 1-week pre-sale for patrons is active right now, so do with that information what you will. Okay, back to Tucson.
There's a gathering of the Rail Passengers Association, which is a nonprofit that advocates for passenger rail nationwide, and it was put on in conjunction with All Aboard Arizona, which is their statewide rail advocacy. And there was a lot of kind of guarded, I don't want to say guarded, there's definitely excitement about passenger rail in Arizona generally, but the Phoenix to Tucson corridor specifically, which was selected as one of the corridors in the corridor ID program for funding, planning, and readiness. So I guess my question is, this was before the election, and there was nervousness about how that was going to turn out and impact things. So I guess I'm wondering, what is I'm kind of a glass half full person by nature. What is the optimist case for maintaining momentum on a lot of these corridors that have been identified and that have had passenger rail service? Almost all of them have had passenger rail service decades ago. What is the case for keeping the momentum to bring some of those back?
Well, I think a big part of the case is that there's local energy and support for this. So, by design, sometimes people ask me, like, why is this on the network or this isn't on the network in these maps that are circulating for the future? But the whole point is we didn't sit here with a map and say, okay, here's where we think all the trains ought to be. Ideas came in, applications came in. We had to do a selection process. But it was not us imposing some vision. It was us responding to visions from closer to home. You look at the response to the resurrection of the Borealis or the establishment of the Borealis route. And there's more, the whole Northern Lights Express, one of the routes in Corridor ID from Minneapolis to Duluth that also connects in Wisconsin. Wherever I go in Wisconsin, from mayors to just people on the ground, people are really excited about that.
If you don't know what the Borealis or Northern Lights are, the Northern Lights is in the Corridor ID and would be a new connection between the Twin Cities and Duluth, Minnesota. And the Borealis is the new Amtrak service that opened in May of this year, connecting the Twin Cities to Chicago, and it immediately started crushing Amtrak's ridership forecasts. Nobody should be surprised. There is absolutely latent demand for passenger rail service, and we finally have an administration that figured out how to tap into that. Sigh.
So it's not just, President Biden loves trains, I love trains, we're going to do a lot of trains. It's that there's this groundswell of people who are seeing, I think, more and more that we ought to have this on American soil at a high level of quality, and asking or demanding that Washington support that. We've done our part, even though the core ID program obviously is very early. It's really about getting some ideas on the drawing board that haven't even had the planning funding that they need so that they can ultimately get into actual revenue service. But it starts here, and these things were never done in a day. So we know that there's going to be an ebb and flow in terms of policy support in Washington. That's for better and for worse. That's part of how it works. But what's not going to go away is the intrinsic value of these systems, and I think the local enthusiasm to see them done.
By the way, as you might have guessed, I'm not actually going to get to what was supposed to be this week's topic, which was my analysis of the most egregious gaps in the US passenger rail network, because I can do that any week, like probably next week, honestly. But I'm probably only going to get one shot at having an actual United States cabinet member on, so I think I'm going to go with that this week.
So one thing about the bipartisan infrastructure law, I think, is there's so much in it that it's hard to crystallize it as any one thing, as any one message, and so that kind of cuts both ways. I guess my question is are there things that you think people just probably don't understand about? I think we're calling it the big deal now, right? The bipartisan infrastructure law, or is there any aspect of it that you think is just severely underappreciated?
Yeah, when I think about the big deal, and to me, the big deal is the answer to the New Deal or the Fair Deal or the Square Deal of previous administrations. Part of what's hard to get our arms around is the bigness of it, just how much was touched in the transportation side alone, not to mention broadband and getting rid of lead pipes and drinking water and improving the electrical grid and all those things happening at once. Because there's so much variety, it is harder to crystallize. It's not one thing. Well, like even the interstate highway system, as massive as it was basically one kind of meta project. This is even bigger than that. But that's why I think the best way to crystallize it is its bigness, the big deal. I think the biggest thing that maybe doesn't get enough attention is that there's a lot of value in the process of creating these projects. So of course, the point is the finished product, the bridge, the tunnel, the new airport. And that's what I'll be excited to see getting completed, having ribbon cuttings for years and years and years after I've left this job. But also, long before the ribbon cutting, these projects have already transformed lives, because the people that I have met, including people who came off active duty and were deciding what to do and found their way into a union apprenticeship in the building trades, high school kids who knew that college wasn't for them but didn't know how they'd make a good living, who found their way into these jobs that they're demanding. They require a lot of smarts and a lot of training, but they're different from jobs that require a 4-year degree, but they pay well. Seeing some of the unions that were having the really lean and hungry years back in my day as mayor, now struggling to find enough people to do the jobs versus trying to find jobs for their workers. That's something that I think we're only just beginning to appreciate, and that will pay dividends in the future too, because the literature on how to make mega projects less expensive and more efficient points to the fact that one of the biggest things you need to do is to have a cadre, a class, a generation of people who've done it before. And once we have years worth of experience for everybody, from an engineer to a carpenter to a lawyer to a line worker, doing this, it's going to make America better at doing this more and more.
This is honestly an angle that I hadn't thought about explicitly, and it was so refreshing to hear Secretary Pete talk about it. Building institutional capacity at our public agencies is just hugely important. And there is a lot of literature out there that talks about this in relation to mega projects. And I just want to shout out the Transit Costs Project at NYU. I don't know that Secretary Pete was specifically referencing this, but it's a research effort that's not only done amazing work, but puts a lot of effort into communicating findings clearly on an actual, useful, public-facing website. I'll link it in the description, because if you want to understand the hurdles to making transit capital projects in the US more affordable and cost-effective, this is a great resource.
One more question. Where do you see yourself 4 or 5 years from now? And then, not unrelated, what do you think are the odds of getting, say, a YouTuber confirmed to be Secretary of Transportation by 51 US senators? Because frankly, I've been watching some of the cabinet nominations recently, thinking I might be overqualified.
Well, I guess every administration's different, but it's certainly something that's interesting to watch. I was joking that if I just spent a little more time on Fox News, they might consider me qualified for Secretary of Defense. Nice. Look, I don't know what the future is going to hold for me, but I know what I care about, and part of what I care about is infrastructure, and the revival of places like the industrial Midwest where I grew up. And I'm going to be out there telling the story of what we achieved and what we set into motion, long past the day a couple months from now when I leave this current assignment. And what shape that takes, I don't know, but it's going to be important to me for the rest of my life that people see the value of these investments and understand that they didn't happen on their own and they were never guaranteed. It took hard work, political leadership, and courage to make them happen. And now we got to make good on what all that funding made possible.
Yeah. All right. Look, I so much appreciate your time, and I so much appreciate all the work you and the administration did in terms of transportation and making our cities more livable and making the connections between them more viable. So thanks so much for that. And hey, you have a great day.
You too. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Look, I had to shoot my shot for 2028. What do you want? Anyway, here's what I take away from this. First of all, yeah, this administration accomplished more when it comes to sustainable transportation infrastructure than I think any administration that's existed in my lifetime. And at the same time, it's so hard to characterize all of it in a single marketable soundbite. Like, even preparing to talk to Secretary Pete, it was a huge task just to narrow down the parts of the bipartisan infrastructure law I wanted to talk about. Like, I didn't even get to Reconnecting Communities, which is a great program that had a central role in my Twin Cities video earlier this year. Here's another thing. There's a pretty high probability that all the documentation of all of the projects and programs that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law is going to be deleted from government websites around, say, January 20th of next year. The next administration is almost certainly going to memory hole all this stuff, so you don't know who it was that actually signed into law this entire package that's going to be making our cities and the connections between them better for years to come. I guess I can't speak for all of you, but I'm going to spend the next 4 years not only missing having an administration that accomplished what it did, but an administration that has people like Secretary Pete who believe in and forcefully argue for all the good things our federal government can do. We've got a long 4 years ahead of us. And that's all I got. Thanks for joining, and thanks as always to the patrons whose direct support has been absolutely instrumental in getting this channel to the level where I can have someone like the Secretary of Transportation on. Probably won't happen for at least another 4 years, so don't get comfortable with it. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.